Welcome, everybody. Welcome back to the last session of the day. My name is Kim Marshall, and I am director of the OU Arts and Humanities Forum. We're one of the co-sponsors of this fantastic day-long symposium. You want to introduce yourself as well?
Ping pong back and forth. Hi, everyone. I'm Daniel Butko. I'm an associate professor in the Division of Architecture. Before we introduce the speakers for the third session today, I would like to invite Felipe Flores and Nayifa Nihad, the OU Security and Context Graduate Fellows, to share about their upcoming event with the OU Center for Peace and Development.
Good afternoon. First of all, thank you so much for giving us the space and time to come here and introduce a very exciting symposium that I'm co-organizing with Felipe Flores. So the Youth Perspectives on Climate Change Symposium is actually one of the first of its kind at the University of Oklahoma, meaning that all of our panelists represent historically marginalized communities in the current climate crisis. In fact, 4 out of 5 of our panelists are indigenous, with representation from the indigenous communities in Oklahoma as well. So the inspiration for the symposium is coming from my lived experiences and realities, coming from an island nation, the island nation of the Maldives, which is at the front line of the current climate crisis, as well as my co-organizer Felipe's experiences coming from Ecuador and his professional experiences working with indigenous communities in the Amazon. So this symposium is coming into fruition with a lot of support and guidance from our mentors. Thank you, Dr. Angela Pearson, the executive committee members of the Center for Peace and Development, as well as the College of Architecture, the College of International Studies, and financial support for the panelists coming from the Carnegie Foundation in New York.
Thank you so much, Nayifa, for saying everything, right? So I have the difficult task to take about the dates of the event. So the event will take place the next Wednesday, April 20th, from 10 to 11:30. It's going to be an online event, completely free and open to the public. We encourage you to assist because it's different to hear the voice from leaders that are like your age experiencing these struggles that we have been talking lately during the whole symposium. So one of the leaders actually is from this university. He's Ace Samuels. He's part of the Native American Studies and also a Jakarta member of the Nation of Oklahoma. And he will be talking about conservationists and how he has been working with his community during the last years. Next one is Naf Asim from the Maldives. She will be talking about how policy changes can actually help to mitigate climate change in relationship with the ocean. This is an amazing 19 years old activist from Ecuador. Her name is Elena Walinga, and she actually achieved something very important with her community, that is stopping oil corporations to enter into her land. She has been part of the COP26, as well as my co-organizer Nayifa, and she has a very powerful voice that I really feel honored to have her as part of our symposium, as well as Efrain Nango, who is an educator, part of the COFENAYE, that is one of the most important indigenous groups in South America, and he's educating young generations of how to mitigate climate change, but also how to respect their traditional values. That aligns with the words of many of the speakers today, to mention some like Dr. Pepler, Dr. Hossam, and how to elevate social capital, as remember Angela Jan mentioned at the beginning of the symposium. And finally, from Brazil, to bring some flavor to the symposium, Gabrielle Alves. She is an environmental activist, and she will be talking about social justice and environmental justice as two elements that are intertwined to working against climate change. Thank you so much for listening.
All right. right. Thank you, Nayifa and Felipe. Quite an exciting event coming up, perfect timing. Our final session today features 4 presentations that explore climate imaginaries, responsive design, and refugee experiences. The first presentation by Emma Colvin, an assistant professor of international and area studies. Dr. Colvin will talk about her work in Jakarta, a place that has been labeled as doomed, and what this means for the city and its inhabitants. The next speaker is Wenwen Cheng, an assistant professor of landscape architecture. Dr. Cheng will discuss her research on climate-responsive landscape architecture.
And then following Dr. Cheng, we'll have Dr. Lee Fithian, who is an associate professor of architecture, and she's going to talk about her research on addressing air quality issues related to urban form. And our session is going to close with Dr. Chie Noyori Corbett, who is an associate professor of social work. She's going to talk about factors that affect refugee resettlement, including her work to create an improved model of resettlement. And before I cede the microphone here to Dr. Colvin, I just wanted to briefly acknowledge that the session was originally planned with the contribution of Dr. David Ebert, who is unable to join us here today. So just as for those of you who don't know, Dr. Ebert is the director of OU's Data Institute for Societal Challenges. We call it the DISC Institute. And he was originally going to present work on intelligent human-computer teaming for resilient communities. So if you are interested in that kind of work or in the kind of work that computer systems and large data management can contribute to these kinds of conversations that we're having here, I encourage you to reach out to him to learn more about that institute and the important data analytics work that they support here at OU. So and now I will turn it over to Dr. Colvin.
Hi, everyone. What a pleasure to be back on campus after 2 years away. I can't think of a better event, and I just feel so honored to be part of this lineup. I'm just going to start my clock so I don't run over. So thank you to Angela, Felipe, Daniel, and Stephanie for organizing this event. It's just really exciting to be in a room with lots of different disciplines and ideas, and I've been scribbling notes on my presentation notes all day, thinking about the intersections between my work and others who have presented. So hopefully we'll see some of these connections as I walk through this. So the question the symposium is taking up is if Plan A was to mitigate against climate change, then what is Plan B? And in my field site, Jakarta, which is currently the capital city of Indonesia, but may not be for very much longer, Plan B is already underway. This is already what people are focusing on. And so to tell you a little bit about this city, it's a city of more than 10 million people. As you can see, it's coastal. It's a delta city punctured by rivers and canals. And it's really become a poster child for the vulnerability of coastal megacities to climate change. It's also become a kind of prototype for the future in a negative way, in that there's been a lot of speculation about how long Jakarta will continue to be habitable, and a lot of projections about when the city will be submerged or even underwater. That's the kind of language that's used. So I'm going to discuss briefly 3 themes that I see in my fields of urban studies and political ecology. I'm a geographer by training, and these are the subfields I situate myself within. So I'll be talking about these 3 themes really briefly, and then I'm going to show you how I see them coming up in Jakarta. So this first theme is one of climate or urban resilience. And I'm sure that Simone recognizes this image from her talk earlier about Louisiana. So urban resilience has really emerged as a new kind of buzzword. So previously it was sustainability, now it's climate resilience. And this is being promoted by a global resilience complex or a kind of network that includes actors like the Rockefeller Foundation and the World Bank. And they've been promoting this idea of urban resilience through policy networks and programs that essentially aim to leverage private sector investment to increase the ability of cities and their residents to bounce back from stresses and shocks. So this is this kind of understanding of resilience as emerging from ecology, the ability to kind of bounce back. And though some activists and communities have claimed this term, and they're actually using this on their own terms, particularly groups in Miami, more broadly, critical scholarship has pointed to the ways in which this term, or this concept, entrenches business as usual while shifting responsibility onto communities. So as Tracy Washington of the Louisiana Justice Institute said, "Stop calling me resilient, because every time you say, oh, they're resilient, that means you can do something to me." And so these posters popped up all over New Orleans. She was interviewed. You can watch it on YouTube, and somebody put these up to kind of comment on the sort of regressive nature of urban resilience. So further, urban studies scholars have noted that despite all of the talk of urban resilience, development plans have not changed. And actually, I'm going to touch on this later, but Todd mentioned the photographer who's been looking at the sort of, on the one end of the spectrum, we have financial speculation and land development in Miami, but we all know that Miami is incredibly vulnerable to sea level rise. How do we make sense of this contradiction? So the second theme, and this is one that Lauren discussed, is the growing awareness of the sort of dark side of adaptation. And the way that it has been, to quote Tin Alvarez, used and abused to realize particular visions of cities, the future of the city, that are typically exclusionary of the urban poor and other marginalized communities. So in Jakarta and other Southeast Asian cities where there's a large informal presence, informal settlements, and I'll discuss this in more detail, this is equated to evicting communities, often large-scale, violent, traumatic events. So I did just want to reference the fact that there is actually this conversation around urban resilience and resiliency planning in the Global South, but the language we use is different. We're talking about evictions, not gentrification. So I think that's maybe one of the sort of barriers to more interdisciplinary work. And so this presence or this occurrence of evictions is especially problematic, and we should be concerned about this, particularly as scientists warn us that we're reaching the technical and financial limits of hard infrastructure approaches, so things like seawalls, polder systems. And it's no longer a question of if, but when we will have to relocate communities away from flood zones and coastal areas. So this, of course, raises serious questions about equity and justice, especially since managed retreat strategies, and I won't go into it, but managed retreat is distinct from climate migration. The kind of strategies we have to realize managed retreat in the US tend to be voluntary buyouts. So these privilege homeowners and homeownership, and they do nothing to protect renters, mobile home park residents, and others who experience insecure tenure. And so in places like Jakarta, where people might have forms of tenure or land titles that are not necessarily recognized by the state, they might not be seen as eligible for compensation or resettlement. So this is really concerning if the way that we're achieving adaptation or pursuing urban resilience is via an approach that prioritizes private property regimes. And then the third theme, which I already alluded to, is speculation and this growing interest in futurity. And scholars have been looking at and observing this contradictory emergence of, on the one hand, intense financial speculation, at the same time as a kind of environmental speculation is taking place. So what does this mean for the future viability of our cities, that they are so vulnerable to climate change and that we're seeing the impacts of sea level rise and so on? So Jakarta is really kind of at the intersection of that contradiction. These two headlines, they're both from the New York Times. They were taken, or they were published about 10 years apart. So the left image actually is when I started working in Jakarta, and the right-hand publication is from a couple of years ago. So on the one hand, we have Jakarta being presented as a place of intense speculative investment where you can make a lot of bang for your buck. They were really kind of attracting foreign investors to Jakarta, and the property market was just booming in around 2014. And then over the last 10 years, there's been growing attention to another kind of representation of Jakarta, which is Jakarta as the sinking, submerged, doomed city. Very kind of stereotypical representations of the southern megacity, of environmental disaster and so on. So I've been interested in thinking about the kind of politics and implications of these representations, of these dystopian imaginaries, when we know that people will continue to live and work in these places that we are narrating as doomed, right? And so it's not actually just the media that participates in these narratives, it's also engineers and consultants. And I choose this image because I think it's really powerful. It's embedded in plans for a coastal development project that has gone through various iterations and is sort of underway now. But this was early in the master plan. And so what you're looking at here is allegedly Jakarta's only options for the future. So they've narrowed all of these possible futures down to 3 scenarios, 2 of which are largely unimaginable for the people that live in Jakarta. So the left-hand side, you have Jakarta submerged as sea levels rise. I mentioned before that Jakarta has subsided, so the city's kind of like a bowl. And so that's the scenario where nothing is done. We just let the sea claim Jakarta. The second scenario might not look as bad, but if you can see in the back of the image the statue, that is Monas, which is the national monument in the city, a very significant land site. So they've obviously chosen this image to draw your attention to the fact that it's not just about Jakarta, it's about Indonesia, right, and the threats that Indonesia is facing. And you'll see perhaps in that image that there's actually some quite large areas of flooding in the main city too. And this would be devastating for Jakarta and the people and the economy. And then the last image is, of course, the master plan that they were proposing, which will save the city through massive land reclamation. So this is the project that they were proposing. And so this was very much what Zach Taylor would call a property-led adaptation regime. It's very representative of that. This was a large-scale coastal defense, but also a coastal development project that would use real estate and extensive land reclamation, over 1,000 hectares, to pay for hard infrastructure. And what was really crucial about this project, similar to what we heard in Louisiana, was that this doesn't actually address the problem. It didn't address the core issue in Jakarta, which is land subsidence. And I could talk at length about land subsidence in Jakarta, but it's connected to development and water infrastructure, not climate change. And that is much more of a concern for Jakarta than climate change, arguably. So these kinds of interventions, such as this one here, they hinge on these large-scale evictions. And so this is a photograph I took in 2016 when I sort of stumbled across Kampung Aquarium. And Kampung Aquarium is a kampung, so an informal settlement in North Jakarta. And what's important to know about this context is that Indonesia has a dual land tenure regime. And so there's, on the one hand, the indigenous system, which is not necessarily recognized by the state. And then there is the formal, what we might sort of more recognize in the US as the formal land tenure system. And there was a program called PRONAUS, which was to formalize people's land titles. So people might have had informal land titles, or ones actually from the Dutch government when it was a colonial, when it was a colony. But people didn't go through that process necessarily of formalizing those because of corruption and the kind of costs. So what happens is that you actually have these communities with really diverse tenure arrangements who are painted by politicians in broad brush strokes as illegal or informal. And so what's happened that I think is especially problematic is that these are often the communities that are most vulnerable to flooding. They're the ones that do not have water security, that experience scarcity. And actually after this eviction, you can imagine the kinds of health consequences of people maintaining, they were living in tents and kind of trying to occupy this space still. And so what happens is these communities are treated as illegal squatters despite actually quite legitimate claims to the land. They're excluded from resettlement and compensation. And the question, of course, is where do they go? And those that are resettled, I could talk about this and I'll just skip over it, but there's all kinds of issues with the kinds of resettlement that Jakarta has pursued. It's not culturally appropriate for these communities, and so people leave. And so you end up with this cycle of people being forcibly evicted, ironically when they're more vulnerable to protect other people, and then they end up having to kind of move around and perhaps move back to other vulnerable kampungs. And what's also kind of doubly ironic about this is that these evictions are taking place in North Jakarta, which, if you're looking at the image on the left, so this is a map of land subsidence, and it's actually from 10 years ago, so the data, it hasn't really shifted too much. The rates are very similar, but what you're looking at in the circle is North Jakarta, and that red area is showing you the highest rates of land subsidence in the city. And this is not an error. It's 16 centimeters a year, which if you imagine the rates that we talk about sea level rise over centuries, and we're talking about 16 centimeters in a year, these are staggering rates of land subsidence. And actually, to think back to Todd's presentation, one of the challenges of land subsidence is that it's not visible to the human eye. So how do you get people to care about it? You can't photograph it. So that's actually been one of the challenges of working on land subsidence in the field, is how do I tell this story? So what's happening in North Jakarta is really high rates of subsidence, very, very vulnerable to flooding, all of these evictions taking place. And then we have the continuation of development practices that actually increase the vulnerability of the city in the first place and reduce urban resilience. And so these are billboards on the right-hand side, about 10 miles away from Kampung Aquarium. And they're advertising various loans to help you buy property that hasn't been built yet on land that hasn't yet been reclaimed off the coast of North Jakarta. So this contradiction is really troubling because of the kinds of inequities that it's perpetuating. And of course, communities are aware of this. They know that when they're evicted, it's likely that a shopping mall or a new gated community will be built in that place. Perhaps even more striking, though, is in 2020, Jokowi, who's the Indonesian president, but also who was once the governor of Jakarta, he announced plans to relocate the capital city away from Jakarta to a new site in East Kalimantan. So he's here talking with the governor of East Kalimantan in 2019. So for those of you that don't know East Kalimantan, this is on the island of Borneo, the Indonesian side. You probably know it more for the orangutans and the forest, right? And very adorably, orangutans translates to people of the forest. So this is an area that is rich in biodiversity, that is important to protect, and Jokowi is proposing to build a new green city, a forest city, a smart city. And this is going to be called Nusantara, so that translates to archipelago, and Indonesia is an archipelago. And so this is a very extreme version of managed retreat, but there's also not much conversation going on about where the people will go. The administrative capital will move, but people will still stay in Jakarta. And furthermore, East Kalimantan, as I've mentioned, is a really important area sort of biodiversity, but also there are indigenous Dayak communities there. And there's an entire history of coal and mining, of large-scale logging, palm oil, don't consume palm oil, and oil and gas, right? So this is already a place that has been extracted and has kind of suffered as a result of capitalist extraction. And so now we're seeing that we're going to produce this new city. And of course, it's not a tabula rasa, it's not a blank space. They're going to have to grapple with these questions. And so just to sort of, and this is the capital city, the plans, and of course it's not the actual plan, but it's the imagining of it. So just to conclude, Jakarta, I think, provides insights into the challenges that lay ahead for many cities and sites around the world. Evictions are legitimized by urban resilience and presented as a necessary evil. And again, this very much echoes what we saw earlier in Louisiana, this idea of it's for the greater good, it's for the bigger picture, right? Some people will suffer, but that's okay. And so what I wanted to close with, or to leave us thinking about, is how do we achieve equitable, just, managed retreat? Is that even a thing? What are the implications for those without tenure security? And who pays the cost of adaptation? And I really want to stress that we need adaptation strategies that decenter private property regimes instead of using property and real estate as a vehicle to supposedly deliver urban resilience. Thanks very much.
Hello, everyone. I'm Wenwen Cheng, and I'm in the Division of Landscape Architecture, College of Architecture, the University of Oklahoma. So I'm very happy to be here and present my study under the topic of resilient futures. So before I start, let me share a little, like a small story of mine. So I live in Texas for like 5 years, and then I moved to Norman in 2020. So last winter was very unforgettable to me because we haven't seen snow for years. And then last winter, 2021, Texas and Oklahoma suffered a historic windstorm in mid-February. The temperature fell as much as 25 to 50 Fahrenheit degree below the average, which broke or reached to the lowest temperature recorded in decades or even a century. However, 4 months later, an extreme heat wave affected much of western North America. This was a 1,000-year weather event which caused more than 1,400 deaths in North America. So what's going on? What is happening to our environment? We are suffering longer and hotter summer days, urban heat island phenomenon, and more intensive and destructive hazards. So among them, I would like to mention that excessive heat was responsible for more premature death than any other hazards in the U.S. As a landscape architecture designer and researcher, we would like to create outside places for people to go out and enjoy the breeze touching our faces, the temperature to be not too high nor too cold, and the sunlight can be just gentle and warm. We care about the changing climate and people in the landscape. So we would like to provide people with safe and comfortable environment through climatically responsive landscape architecture design. So this is today my topic, climatic responsive landscape research and design. To achieve this goal, it is important for us to look at 3 questions. So first is, where are the vulnerable locations to changing climate? And the second is, who are the vulnerable populations? And the third one is, how can we do climatic responsive landscape architecture design? So when we look at a city or a region, heat vulnerability index, which is analysis of a sensitivity, exposure, adaptive capacity that considering environmental, social, and climatic factors can help us to determine the regions and population who are at high risk of being affected by heat waves. So through a systematic literature review, we reviewed all the current heat vulnerability index studies to answer 2 questions. What are the effective variables and how to measure them? And the second is, how effective are current heat vulnerability index in predicting urban heat vulnerability? So we summarized the framework for index construction, calculation, and validation. So for heat vulnerable index, we will need to include socioeconomic status and cultural backgrounds such as age, gender, income, and cultural backgrounds, as well as health conditions, including physical and mental health conditions, as well as environmental and climatic factors. After we collect all the data for the variables, we will do sensitivity analysis and explicit or statistic weighting to them to generate the heat vulnerability index. To validate the index and to test the efficiency of the model, we will use the geolocated heat-related outcomes to see the efficiency of this heat vulnerability index. So for example, this is a heat vulnerability index we generated for Bryan College Station in Texas by considering physical environmental factors such as land surface temperature, NDVI land use and land cover, as well as climatic factors such as the weather, the data from the weather condition, as well as social vulnerability index. So if you look at the right map, the more red it is, the more vulnerable it will be. After we identify those vulnerable areas, we would like to zoom in to the community level to see how community morphology will actually affect community level microclimate and affect resident heat stress. So this is one of my ongoing project that we mapped the heat flux, energy flux for the low-income communities for different arrangement, as well as the housing locations and arrangement for different shade and canopy and also ground material, thus to reflect the thermal comfort level for low-income communities. And the next question is, who are the vulnerable population that we need to pay specific attention to? So when we talk about the thermal comfort, so basically the concept is pretty straightforward and easy. So when you feel warm or hot, it's basically you store more heat than you lose. And when you feel cold or cool and then you lose more heat or energy than you stored in your body. So the energy budget model helps us to demonstrate the heat exchange between our body to the environment. So we gain heat through metabolic heat, radiation, and we lose our heat through convection, evaporation, and emitted radiation. So when we look at the inputs of this fundamental equation of energy budget, it includes both microclimatic and climatic parameters that are air temperature, humidity, radiation, and wind, as well as human factors, including metabolism and clothing. So among the increasing incidence of heat-related illness and injuries, children compose almost half of this population, and we consider children as a heat-vulnerable group. However, the thermal comfort model that I introduced previously, we have more than 160 different models. They are all designed and developed based on adults' conditions which are not appropriate for children. So children has both physical and physiological differences compared to adults, with higher surface area to mass ratio, higher metabolic rate, lower sweating rate, and higher skin temperature. So when we look at this equation, we actually modified several parameters and then into children's version, and we created a children's thermal comfort model that is called ComfaKit. In order to further validate this model, we collect the microclimatic data and then put this data into our model, and then get the thermal comfort level from our model. To validate this model, we collect the actual thermal feeling from survey among more than 68 children, and then we compare the results from their actual thermal feeling with the predicted thermal feeling. So our results shows that actually the ComfaKit model can be used to predict children's outdoor thermal comfort with a pretty high accuracy. And the next result is a little bit interesting. Then when adults feel cool, children feel okay. When adults feel warm, children feel hot. So children actually prefer to stay in a cooler environment. So when your mom tells you to put on a sweater, it's because of she's feeling cold, probably not you. So the last question is, how can we do climatic responsive landscape architecture design, and what are the facts that we need to know? So first, let me ask you a pretty simple question. Why does it feel cooler in the shade? Even the shade for probably just one tree. Is it because of the lower air temperature under that tree or the higher humidity for that? In order to answer this question, I rode a bike, and then this is super heavy, and I mounted all the devices collecting meteorological data. And I rode it from Urban Hot Island, that is a parking lot, all the way past through a natural preserve, an urban park, and then to the campus parking lot. So from my results, although they passed different land covers and then including parking lots and urban parks, the differences of the air temperature actually is just the 2.7 Celsius degree. However, the differences of the radiant temperature can be as much as 21 Celsius degree. So air temperature and relative humidity are relatively consistent within a certain area at a specific height that is hard to be modified through landscape architecture design. However, wind and radiation is another story that is easy to be modified through landscape architecture design. So these two, that is wind and solar radiation and terrestrial radiation, are the components that we need to pay specific attention to during our design process. So the facts we got from research support our design, support our evidence-based design. So let's focus back on children. Playgrounds in schools are a very important space for children that they spend at least 1/3 of the time for their school time. So what are the efficiency design strategies in providing children with thermally comfortable environments? This is one of my projects, and I investigated all the primary schools in Norman, and finally we selected 8 different playgrounds with different design strategies. 2 of them has both trees and canopies, and 2 of them with only artificial canopies, and then 2 of them with some side trees, and then 2 of them with no shade at all. So we collected the microclimatic data, including air temperature, humidity, wind, speed, and direction, solar radiation, and surface temperature, and put them into the ComfaKit model to get children's thermal comfort level. At the same time, we collected environmental characteristic data such as sky view factor, canopy size, tree size, and tree species to know what design characteristic will provide thermally safety environment for children. For example, in Norman, Oklahoma, in a summer day on July 19th, 2021 at noontime with an air temperature of as much as 92 Fahrenheit degree and a wind speed is 0.5 meters per second and humidity is 40%, solar radiation is 1,000 watts per square meter. On the left side for the picture with a pretty good shaded playgrounds, it is safe for children to play outside for as long as 1 hour, and then their thermal comfort level will range from comfort to the caution of heat stress, depends on their activity intensity. However, for a playground on the right side with no shade at all, it is pretty dangerous for children to play outside for more than, 20 minutes. And then their heat stress level will range from caution to extreme danger of heat stress based on their activity level. So trees is such an important design element in landscape architecture, and then we would like to know what specific tree species will provide with a better solar protection for children. So we actually calculate the tree solar transmissivity for the trees that we investigated in all the playgrounds in Norman. And it turns out that some species, for example, the Acer rubrum, that is a red maple, and or the celery pears or Siberian elm, those trees will provide with better protection of solar radiation than other trees. So from previous study, all other design strategies in providing thermally comfortable environment are kind of summarized here. So from left to right, you can have a warmer feeling, and from right to left, it helps you to create like a cooler environments. So this is pretty much for my presentation today, and then we learned a little bit about how, where do we identify those heat vulnerable areas as well as heat vulnerable populations, and how can we do climatic responsive landscape architecture design. So before I end my presentation, I would like to make a small advertisement for my lab. It's called Microclimatic Landscape Architecture Research Lab. Pretty long name. And then this is a website of our lab, and then we're going to update our studies and then projects or published papers on the website. So thank you very much.
Good afternoon. My name is Lee Fithian. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me, my colleagues, thinking that the fun stuff I get to do is worth sharing. My research starts from being an architect and a practicing architect. After joining the academy, I realized the research components that are associated with that make it very amenable to working with really diverse groups of communities. So part of my evolution in that particular arrangement became getting a PhD in engineering and applying some of the things that I had learned in practice to identify and solving problems in the built environment. So this particular presentation is related to some of my research, and then some of the research, how it evolved and worked with the Big Idea Challenge with the Vice President of Research and Partnerships. So urban planning and design guidelines sort of lag considerably behind the growing science of climate change, and they're mostly inadequate for considering multi-parameter heat-related and air quality health risks, evaluating and predicting the impact of urban planning and design at different scales in mitigating and future heat stress and air quality is critical to developing effective policy interventions and public health guidance. This problem creates a critical need to investigate the physical characteristics contributing to the vulnerability of our urban populations and provide design interventions to mitigate the problem. Lots of big words that I would not use with my clients. Okay? So this presentation, like I said, involves VPRP and the Big Idea Challenge, and that in and of itself was quite an opportunity. Big Idea Challenge from the VPRP, they funded 5 research teams at OU. They got internal funding to support innovative research projects, and it was primarily set up to foster research teams towards transdisciplinary and convergence research. What the large funding, national funding organizations were finding, NSF and whatnot, that a lot of the science that they had funded wasn't finding its way into the communities to which they were trying to serve. So our particular project involved parts that include sensor teams, looking at greenhouse gases, how do we take that information, model it with the rest of the understanding of atmospheric science modeling, and bring it down into the urban design guides that were associated with it. The significance of that, the VPRP was trying to point out what all of the global challenges were and how we were going to address them. We had a human interface, we had air quality issues, but greenhouse gases and their impacts on human health were the ultimate opportunity that our team was seeking to address. The health impacts, we talked a little bit about economics. You can't address a population without the educational impacts. And then how do we bring that full circle to a feedback loop to work with policy impacts? So our team was called XGEM, Enhancing Future Community Sustainability with Greenhouse Gas Monitoring. It was led by JiaBin Huang. He was assistant professor in electrical and computer engineering. He's like the core of the sensor team. Wes Honeycutt, Oklahoma Biological Survey, go-to guy. I got pictures of him later. Ming Xu in meteorology was modeling, taking that atmospheric models and how we would apply them. It was myself and Ed Sankowski, who's in philosophy, but was really working with Dr. Betty Harris, who was doing an IRB sort of survey, structured survey that was going to go out into the community to see if we could find those health impacts. And then Farouk Mistry and AME was working with the cyber social physical space. So the components and the sensors, low cost, developing to monitor greenhouse gas. We had the modeling group that I've spoken about. Relating all of those results to human habitat design was part of my responsibility. Collaborative community engagement was also part of that structured design survey was part of that. And then those social systems where the big data would come in. How do we prevent some of this climate action failure is trying to translate that science and give it to the policymakers. And we need those tools to get a better understanding of what's happening in the world, and we need the models to provide a better understanding of the complex environmental dynamics. And we need to understand how the built environment influences greenhouse gas, and human health provides harm mitigation tools. So what's the impact of the solution on the community? And then it's sort of unraveled. And I was pleased to note that when we did our final outbriefing with the VPRP, that of the 5 teams, our team was productive. There was another team that was already established and working together, was very productive. And then a couple of teams just dropped out. They couldn't find a way to communicate and work together. So the initial concept is here. We're going to take satellite data, and we're going to have remote understanding of what the CO2 is, and greenhouse gases at the street level. And then we're going to do a second level remote sensing at a particular height with the drones and whatnot, and then we'll be able to refine that model. And then we'll go down and we'll do like Dr. Cheng was doing and get some climate data there on the street, and then we'll bring it all together and we'll have this great model and we'll give it to the people and they'll work really, really well. And this was the first image that we got. This is what a satellite data scientist thinks the city of Oklahoma City looks like. And once again, you know, that architecture training steps in and we're trying to find a communication method. How can we figure out where we are in this city? So I kind of like took the Latin longs, and this is basically isolating a particular area, and we sort of went through and evolved, and you'll see in a few minutes how we got to that. In the meantime, our teams are working really great. The geocarb satellites out there, the drones are working, and they're grabbing more data, and they're making these beautiful maps. The sensor guys are out there, and they're in these rural areas, and they're mapping fugitive emissions from methane releases, and they have all of these wonderful carbon mappings and CO2 taking the drones, and there's no people there, right? Got all these sponsorships and partnerships, but there's still no people there. And so what we then did was came back, and Dr. Cheng was on my team as well, and we took this little area and sort of highlighted it, something that, you know, my familiarity from practice time, East Reno Corridor, 2005, we knew that there were problems there. They had metal recycling. We had looked at it. We think that there's a problem there. And then we looked at it then in 2005, and you can see in 2020 it's almost exactly the same. Dr. Cheng created a social vulnerability index with street names, which most people recognize, not just latitude and longitude, and identified the larger Oklahoma City area. And then we overlaid that with newer tools with environmental justice issues related to urban air quality, and we're able to sort of narrow it down to realize that the same things were still happening, even though that they were in 2005, but now we have a lot of data to back it up, and that's where we're going to be looking. So if you're familiar with ticktock, we're going to little screeching sound that the needle makes on the album, and we're going to go, now wait a minute. And we're going to talk about how my part relates to it. One called the Urban Canyon Lab. And what this is a mid-scale urban canyon air pollutant model. I got to work with a really great team, AME, capstone team. My research involved taking urban canyon types. It's a certain specific morphology of related building structures and the space between them. What happens is the air goes over the top, but any pollutants that are down here recirculates, and most people are walking here and here. We do that because urban growth is going. It's where the people are. We want to make sure that we make the right design guides. There are green infrastructure that's supposed to be put in there, but it doesn't really mitigate those gases. Developed a system based upon my experience as an architect using a double-skin facade. It was taking up air from the ground, sucking it up here, and then blowing it away. It managed to work. We got a patent published on it. The research was completed, and the capstone students built a prototype because we wanted to take it out of the lab and take it into a sort of real-world situation, as well as sort of do the demonstration validation of it. So, again, a canyon is basically something that's higher than it is wider. We came up with the idea of using 2 shipping containers, having them perpendicular to prevailing winds. We have them out there at the north base. They're the red boxes that people go, what are they doing there? And we built the prototype and attached it. Well, this is the plan, and then the pandemic hit. So that's where it was going to go, and everything was set up. Love the optimism of the AME. They had these cute little computer fans that they were going to put in here. They hadn't worked in the real world. They had no idea of the winds at North Base, and created the prototype with the airflow coming in. It's basically a big vacuum cleaner. Okay? So model the air quality, you can read that. I think the presentations are going to be provided. This is sort of me out there when I'm not dressed up. And these are the cans. There's the prototype. It's one of the LA GAs. We had the drones flying out there to get air samples to see what mitigation effects the prototype was going to do. He was too scared to fly between the two. I guess it was too narrow. He thought he was going to lose control, which is why I'm getting a drone pilot license so that I can fly it myself. But the neat thing is, if you look real closely, you can see the sensors up here. We have them sensors all the way at the bottom. It's a place where we can practice building the sensors. Wes Honeycutt built the sensors. Dr. Wes Honeycutt built the sensors and put them welded through the metal on some things, replaced them multiple times. But what you see below is the massive amount of data that he generated, clocked it in, and what it's showing is that we have a differing effect between the north side and the south side, which matches the way it's supposed to operate, and we know from wind tunnel studies. So the system's validated. The next thing was, can we get it to work? And it does, and it sucks it up. So, yay, it works. This is really good because what we did next was, okay, now we got to focus on the issues that we have at hand with the greenhouse gases. And so he's throwing in all sorts of CO2, getting it out, moving it, and what he told me was he just used this as a big vacuum cleaner so they could run more studies all the time because it cleared out the canyon all the time, and I'm going, yes. All right, so what he did was ventilator coordination. You can see the results. CO2 generators, they were sensitive enough to catch somebody's breathing, CO2 coming out. And then we have the start of the test. You have the ventilator turned on, turns off, it evacuates it, end of the study. And you saw this from outside. You can see these three different ones. It's determined to beat the boundary layer because when we have, I'll hurry, but you promised me an extra minute. Okay. She's my student, so I have some control. Determined to make it work, but wasn't going inside the canyon. So gotta love the engineers. This is Wes out there. This is a tub of a massive CO2 generator. He was generating approximately 3.3 kilograms of CO2. The boundary layer would go over this, and then he has a sensor right here in the CO2. And we had some really, I saved a picture. This is him tossing. I'm supposed to be there to pull him out in case he passes out, but I was taking pictures too. So anyway, what we ended up, and it worked, beat the boundary layer. You have this massive influx of pollution, and it's coming in and it's falling into the urban canyon. So we have the reaction begins, it goes into, the sensor picks it up, and then it declines. So this has got such potential for us to keep working with that canyon lab because we can't put those sensors in the real world. People don't like to put them on their buildings. We're trying to adapt with field laboratories, and they don't let us. So that lab that was put there for the prototype and working with understanding what the sensors wanted to do, we've been able to coordinate and create this sort of space where they can go out and they can practice and fly the drones, test the sensors, see where the mounting is right, gather the data. It took a long time for him to get it to say 8:05, 8:10, 8:15 because he uses Zulu time, and why not? Because none of us can coordinate. You saw Dr. Cheng, she knows what real time is. And so trying to get a sync up of those outputs was a big deal. So our next steps are my prototype got hooked in a wind event and ripped off. The lashings ripped off, and so I have to repair it. But we're going to start working with more and more sensitive sensors and continue adapting and moving forward with the XGEM, even though that particular funding from the VPRP was finished. So thank you.
Good afternoon. I am Colvin. I'm from the School of Social Work. My both research and practice area have been always on refugees and also human trafficking victims, especially international human trafficking victims, and especially I focus on women. I have been interested in why women really are moving around more than men on a global scale. I wanted to know what are the causal factors, the motivation for women to move more than men. What could be the consequences of that move for these women? And before I start this presentation, I'd like to just share the simple differences between immigrants and refugees. And I'm sure many of you know the difference, but immigrants are more like myself. I'm originally from Japan. I wanted to come to the States as an international student. That was my own will. I wanted to come here, but also had other choice to stay in my country, in Japan. I was happy there too. But for refugees, they had no other choice, but they have to leave their country. It's just like what's happening right now with the Ukrainians. There's no way back. They have to leave their country, and they have to find a place to be settled. Okay. So I would like to talk about some connections between gender, climate change, and also migration, and also human trafficking. And gender serves as a very important dimension of both vulnerability by and also adaptation to climate change. And also climate change and poverty are closely related. The poorest and also the most disadvantaged people, the group of people, tend to depend on the climate-sensitive livelihoods such as agriculture. So this is the reason these people are very vulnerable to climate change. And these groups also lack the resources needed to weather harsh climate impact, such as better houses and also drought-resistant crops. So women in developing countries are particularly vulnerable to climate change because they are highly dependent on local natural resources for their livelihood. And also women charged with the in developing countries, women for charged with the securing water, food and fuel for cooking and heating, they face greater challenges every day. So there is a solid base of evidence showing that women are disproportionately affected by climate change, not because there's something inherently vulnerable about women, but because of social cultural structures that deprive women of access to resources, also the information, also decision making. Also, countries with a higher level of gender inequality, they usually see lower level of the climate actions. Okay, so in Paris Agreement of 2015, parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, they are asked to respect and promote the obligation on gender equality. And also it is obvious that gender plays a role in the development of migration policies, which is also recognized in this Paris Agreement in 2015. The example of the inclusion of gender of the Paris Agreement's operative paragraphs indicates the importance of both gender-responsive practices and policies and also gender-responsive capacity-building approach. So the Paris Agreement also acknowledges the rights of migrants in the context of climate change actions. Also, parties to the UNFCCC, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, have recognized the importance of involving women and men equally in the decision-making process and also the development and implementation of national climate policies. So, as you can see in this diagram, gender can be a moderating variable between climate change and migration. There are a range of factors explaining this, including the occupation, income, and educational level, which can affect a person's vulnerability to the impacts of climate change. Women are particularly disadvantaged by these factors due to deep-rooted social norms and also socioeconomic structures. Okay. So as a result, women tend to cross borders more than men. And women are more vulnerable to be trafficked, especially for the purpose of sex trade, human trafficking. Okay. And the feminization of poverty is one of the causal factors of feminization of migration and human trafficking. It means that the determinants of feminization of poverty globally influence production of human trafficking as a response to the International Division of Labor Market Demand. It means that the factor linking the feminization of poverty, migration and human trafficking is the divide between global north and south. Liberalization of the world marketplaces indicative of global capitalism is separating the north and north economically. So this divide is one of the more significant reasons people cross the border, typically from the poorer countries to wealthier countries. And the female, particularly younger ones, they tend to cross border more so that they can gain relatively better wages, and therefore they can send back remittances to their families back in their countries. So women in developing countries are much more pressured. They're pressured to cross the border to help their families, and that's why they are more vulnerable to be trafficked to other countries. Okay. This is the one of the diagrams in my publication with Dr. Moxley, and back the time, shame on myself, I did not include the fact of climate change influencing how women are crossing borders more, and they are vulnerable to be trafficked. This is a really relatively new factor influencing all these factors within this diagram, including those global capitalism and global polarization. So the women in developing countries, they are at the bottom of this pyramid, and they really are vulnerable to be trafficked to different countries. I'm sorry, I have to move back. So it's best to prevent these events, to help them not to experience any more misfortune. That's the best way to do this. We have to prevent these things. However, if we cannot, what we can do, especially in this country, is to now protect and to support these women. If once they come to the United States as refugees, we need to find a way to protect them in a better way, because these people are still experiencing the misfortunes in this country. And it's mainly due to the policies, how policies were written for refugees, which I will talk a little bit later. So since I moved to Oklahoma, to OU, I have been conducting this lengthy community participatory action research with the Myanmar refugee women in Dallas, Texas area. Dallas is one of the cities accepting the bigger number of refugees in the United States. And there's a section called the Vickery Meadow, and which is also called Little United Nations. If you walk into that area in Dallas, you feel like you're in a foreign country. And this is exactly where I was working as a practitioner. I was a social worker. I was a program coordinator for the refugee youth program. So by helping refugee youth, I witnessed so many difficulties, obstacles of these women, mothers, experience in the United States. And relatively men, fathers really would they become more acculturated quicker than mothers because they will go out and they work and they learn English outside. But mothers are usually left behind. And in the cases in Dallas with Myanmar refugees, most of the husbands, they could not get a job in Dallas area, so they would go to work in a meat factory in Texarkana, which is three hours away from Dallas. So fathers would go to Texarkana, stay there together in tiny little apartment, 6 to 10 fathers in one tiny little apartment, and they'll come back only once a month or once in 2 months. So mothers here are left alone with many children, usually 4 to 5 children in one household, taking care of children by themselves. And if you see this picture here, this is not what I took. This is from the newspaper, but you see the women in hijab. I assume these people are they're called Rohingya. And maybe you might have heard of this group of people from Myanmar. And Rohingya Rohingya, a stateless ethnic group from Rakhine State of Myanmar, which is on the west side of Myanmar. They've been described as one of the most persecuted minorities in the world. They have experienced violations to the freedom of movement and social, political, and economic rights, as well as enduring inhumane acts such as killing, sexual violence, including rape, burning the villages. So they went through a lot already because for being stateless. So once they are forced to leave their village, where they go is usually they will cross the border to Bangladesh because there are many refugee camps. Actually, there's one of the largest refugee camp in Bangladesh, which is called Cox's Bazar, which is on the more of southeast Bangladesh, very close to the Bengal Bay. Which is actually the area vulnerable to cyclones, flooding, and also landslides. It means they have to face displacement again and again and again. And on top of that, since 2016, because of the change of the political climate in the United States, we start to receive much less number of refugees. These Rohingya were supposed to come to the United States and resettle. But the number of the Rohingya refugees came to the States went down dramatically after the year of 2016. I remember interviewing some Rohingya people in 2015, but not after 2016. So enough about talking about their misfortunes and difficulties and obstacles. As a social work researcher, whenever I conduct participatory action, community-based participatory action research, I always try to be mindful of focus not only on difficulties and needs, but also strength, because everybody has strength. So I had to do some interviews with these Myanmar refugee women, and I found out these women have many skills and knowledge to survive. One of them are sewing, especially the group called Hakachin, these people from Cheng state of Myanmar. And they usually do not cross the border, but they cross the sea to go to Malaysia. And Malaysia is not a signatory country of the United Nations Refugee Agency. Means they're not going to be refugees, but they will be there as undocumented immigrant. Means they get to work as undocumented immigrant. That's where they gain these skills of sewing. So when I met with them, one lady had this one studio that she's doing her own business. She would make beautiful dress, traditional dress like in one day and sell it online. So there's some women trying to survive in the United States with their own skills. Also, in 2015, my first collaborator for this project, Dr. Bhattacharjee from the College of Architecture, we started to investigate the living conditions of Myanmar refugee families in Dallas area. And when we were visiting their households, many households of I'm sorry, it's moving by itself. And household, we found out several backyards of these women. They grow vegetables and animals. So we asked the questions. They told us that this is exactly how they lived in Myanmar and also the camps in Thailand. So they live in a very sustainable living style. They also, some people would save the rainwater. They use these water for gardening and also washing clothes, because these people do not use washing machine. They wash the clothes by hand. So we realized that probably people in host community, we can really learn a lot from these people how to live more in a sustainable living style. So what can we do to help these refugees once they come to the United States? And what is the problem? Problem is, based on my research in the past, is the policy. Policy is supposed to help refugees. But because how it was developed, how it was conceptualized, especially the construct of the resettlement, was conceptualized only through the eyes of the stakeholders, especially the policymakers and NGOs, that was not really refugee friendly. One example is that these refugee people are supposed to become self-sufficient within 6 months, which is really impossible. They have to speak English and they have to get a job. And also, this policy lacks gender-responsive conceptualization of the construct of the resettlement too. So the government conceptualization of the settlement, that really it does not focus on outcome process, only the outcome. They ask people to become independent in 6 months. They do not really focus on gender differences neither. As a result, these refugees are actually disempowered. They start to depend on the government resources longer, actually, with this policy. If we could really invest more for these refugees at the beginning, we can stop that cycle of relying on the government resources for a long time. Actually, Myanmar refugee people are believed to become second Cambodians, means they really would rely on the government resources. This is mainly because these Myanmar people are very less assertive. They do not raise voices, and we have to find a way to help them raise voices. So at the end, I knew from the beginning this is not the easy job for me to tackle by myself. And 2 years ago, the time of the Big Challenge project, with Dr. Bhattacharjee, we started to recruit more people from the faculty member in different colleges here at OU so that we can tackle this problem all together. We have now 10 members. We're trying to develop this more sustainable and holistic refugee resettlement model. And we named this group Humanitarian Innovation Research Group. Our final long-term goal is to start the Center for the Humanitarian Innovation Research at OU. And we have done several, we have already submitted, and we will be submitting more large-scale external grants so that we can help refugees who live in this country, and we can just stop the reincarnation of the misfortunes of these women coming from the developing countries so that they can enjoy their lives too. Thank you.
Okay, I think we'd like to invite all our speakers up to have a bit of a question and answer session. And once everyone gets up here, we can invite some questions from the audience. Well, I have many questions I could start with, but I think let's start and see what others have to say first. So, questions from the audience. Yeah, Stephanie.
Thank you all for a really fantastic last session today. I'm interested, after hearing Dr. Colvin's presentation on Jakarta and thinking about climate adaptation planning, and then Dr. Nayifa and Corbin's ending presentation, if in Jakarta there are any discussions of the different needs of women, like that just came to mind seeing all of these together, if that's part of the discussion.
I think just hold it up and start talking. And
Okay, is that on? Yeah. That's a great question. Not that I'm aware of, but I don't think... So there have been these evictions that have taken place that have been really high profile, and that was kind of unusual for Jakarta because since the fall of Suharto and with the growth of civil society, it became a lot less tenable to just evict people. But that did happen more and more since 2015, often citing flood mitigation. With the new governor now, Anies Baswedan, he's been trying to work with communities. It's been stalled because of COVID, but they've been trying to do sort of intense participatory approaches, working with local communities to realize not so much resettlement actually, but sort of in situ upgrading. And so they're kind of testing this with, I think, 13 or 14 kampungs. My colleague Dion Triarawati at UCLA has been looking at that work, and I've never heard in those discussions, I spoke with some people, some architects and planners who have been involved in that work and the work leading up to it. And I've never really heard any discussion of gender. But of course, women are disproportionately affected by the kinds of resettlement that takes place. And so typically, those families that are determined to be eligible for compensation are moved to Rusunawa, which are public housing apartment blocks. They look very much like the modernist housing blocks in the 50s and 60s that we then demolished for good reason. And so they relocate families randomly into these, they're typically walk-up apartments, 3 or 4 stories. And the main difference between those and the kinds of kampungs that people are used to living in is that there's no space for kind of community socializing. There's no space to run a business from your home, which is something that women would do. And so often you find that women who would have made their money selling food to local workers, for example, or out of a food stall, they've lost those opportunities. And so they tend to not be working anymore and be at home. So the designs they have at the moment that they've implemented have not accounted for even the kinds of needs of the community, let alone specifically of women. But that might well be changing with what they're calling the community action plan or the kampung action plan.
Other questions? Let's do the front row.
Dr. Colvin, this question is for you. You mentioned that the language used for the Global South is different than what's used for the Global North. I was wondering, what that specific language is, what it entails, and does that mean that there's different responses for disasters in the Global North versus the Global South? And if so, how do we go about changing that language to make those responses similar?
That's a great question. And so when I'm talking about different kind of language or vocabulary, I'm actually thinking about urban studies and the way that we've tended to sort of categorize the global north and the global south as different regions that are kind of incompatible. But of course, we're seeing with climate change, there's lots of similarities across those contexts. And so with specific regards to climate gentrification, and gentrification is a term that's kind of bandied around a lot, and we all kind of think we know what it means, and it's a very kind of powerful organizing concept. But analytically, it's not that useful anymore, I would argue, and it certainly doesn't capture things like forced evictions that are happening in places like Jakarta and Manila. But I do think there's opportunity still to be learning across those different contexts. And so I think it's losing maybe it's balancing between acknowledging the particularity of particular sites, but also trying to find a kind of common language where you can learn from like what they're doing in Miami and vice versa, right? It's not just about learning from the global north and transporting that to the global south. Arguably, we probably need to be learning more from what people are doing in places like Jakarta at the grassroots level. So that's the kind of way I'm thinking about it in terms of like the academic discourse and our own blind spots in terms of the places that we think are comparable and can be in conversation and the ones that can't.
There was a question, Kairesh? Yeah.
Thank you to all the panelists. I have a question for the collective of the panelists. So a topic that was brought up today a lot was that resiliency seems to be the next trending label for efforts of preventing climate change and all the crises that are kind of ahead of us. I can't help but to feel that the corporate entity might use this new label as something to buy more time for themselves, like a sustainability. They just kept using the sustainability term until we got to the point that we are saying, well, prevention action might not be feasible anymore. Now we need to be resilient to the changes. And I feel like they might just keep using it until this phase is also over. They're going to come up with a new label, I don't know, adaptability. Hit the fan, now we have to adapt to the new situation. So I wanted to know what can we do, especially us as a body of students or recently graduates, to kind of push past that and actually take effective action that's going to have meaningful effects rather than just coming up with new ideas but not bringing it into the field.
I'll take that one. Koresh is one of my students, so it's actually... Is this talking? It's talking. He's one of my students, so this is a good discussion and we're taking it back. But I've been in sustainability for over 20 years. I have been through the times when I wasn't allowed to use the word sustainable because it was passé, and we started using the words of equity and environment and economy associated with that. I don't see it any different with resiliency. Resiliency is actually a way of extending the operations that we're talking about, being more comprehensive with all of the equity issues, being more comprehensive with the environmental issues and taking into account climate change, understanding that it can't just be a corporate responsibility for paying for things, that there's ways that we can imbue the economics of the situation with equity and environmental content. A lot of the things that we're talking about. So part of what we teach you in school is to be critical thinkers, right? So you hear that, you think that it's a new term, you break it apart, you do the research, you apply the knowledge that you have, and you start and keep moving and pushing it forward despite what the forces around you might be.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question, and I would say me too. I see those labels everywhere, and then so I agree with Dr. Fifi in that. So we think we have the critical thinking when we teach you at the school, and another thing that you may want to also I guess identify is evidence-based design. That is how we actually use the research results or the facts that we get from our empirical study to apply to our I guess because you're from architecture, I guess, so it's like design process. So to identify, because you mentioned like a lot of labels like this is sustainable and this is resilient, those kind of words, but some can be pretty kind of vague that we don't know what it's talking about, right? They have no actual meanings. So yeah, so unless we use more like evidence or facts that we got from our experiments, and then we use that as a tool to support our design, so that can be more convincible to me, I guess.
Thank you for that question. That makes me think of this, the method I always use, community-based participatory action research. We really do involve the participants from the beginning. When we construct the questions, when we use certain words, we have to work with them. And they might say, I might be too sensitive maybe. If I use certain word, my participants say, oh, we don't really worry about that. So it's really important to ask questions, look for the more deeper meaning of the word. Not the word itself, but what does it mean? This word mean to this certain person who is in this phenomena you're trying to investigate. And rather than just only keep reading the books, it's good to hear the voices of these people. That's probably you have to use this qualitative method of the interview. You have to have this interview with these people with maybe very culturally sensitive questions to ask. And you have to build this, even construct these questions with the participants.
I think, just to add to that, and just to give you an anecdote, I suppose, when I was interviewing someone in the city planning department in Jakarta, and this was around the time of Pokemon Go being really big, and I asked him about the Rockefeller Foundation program, and Jakarta had a master plan for all of that, or a resiliency plan, and I asked him, what does this mean for the work that you're doing? And he basically was like, well, whether it's like sustainability, resilience, like resilient city, Pokemon Go city, like whatever, I'll just say whatever they want, and then I'll get the funding and keep doing what I'm doing. So I think we don't want to exaggerate the kind of impacts that these policy networks kind of have and these ideas about resilience. But then on the flip side, in New Orleans, they were trying to build a resilient dashboard. And this it was supposed to address flooding, and through various kind of, I don't know what happened with the planning process, but they ended up basically developing like a predictive policing tool with some tech companies. So there's also like the insidious side of that too. But I want to echo others here in saying that there's so many different definitions of that concept, and so paying attention to the way people are using it. And I mentioned in passing that work by Kevin Grove and Savannah Cox in Miami have said, well, actually people are using that term resilience in their community organizing. So we can't necessarily just push it aside and not deal with it anymore because they're claiming it in their own way.
I see. Dave, you have a question?
Well, that's not a question, it's a comment. Resiliency, sustainability, academics are great at presenting papers at conferences and going all over the place and presenting more papers, but it's all about policy. If you don't change policy, you just have those terms. And so to me, that's the most important thing that academics can do, is actually get involved in planning commissions and city councils and regional ACOGs and interact in those ways, because that way when you're approaching those people and becoming those people that have to make those decisions, you can actually institute the kind of policies that you write papers and present at conferences.
Would you like some comments back? They can reply if you want. Okay.
I think one of the things we've heard today is that we need to decenter academics as experts. And so I totally hear what you're saying, and I wonder if our role should also be facilitating conversations between communities and policymakers, rather than kind of missing out on that connection.
Last time I was at an EDRA conference, it was just, I heard all these PhD students presenting, and it was all the same topics, and it was one room after another, and they're working on their dissertation, and they're working on their thesis project, and they're going, God, let me get these things out there and make them part of policy and part of the community, because I know everybody's got to write a dissertation, I know everybody's got to graduate and get their PhD and a master's degree, but what do you do with it then? Where does that go? And to me, it's a matter of stepping into the community.
I agree with.
Switch up. Yeah.
I agree with that. Coming from social work, when I teach research to my students, I always say community-based participatory action research is the social worky research. You have to bring changes to the community where you just got the data from. And it's based on my experience. Whenever I try to collect the data with the Myanmar refugee people, at the beginning, even though I was there as a practitioner prior to that data collection stage, they all told me, again, you're from university? I remember another one came to me and asked me a question, and you got all the information from us, then they leave. They never come back. So that was my promise, my internal promise I made to these people. That's another reason I'm forming this bigger group to help these refugees. We've been working on some, actually, the grants, not for the research only grants, but also grants that we can bring jobs to refugees, jobs to these women. Not only the policies, but also the practices. We have to bring some kind of interventions that will make these people's life much better. So I always emphasize that we have to do the action research. We have to bring some changes to the society and the communities, exact community you just collected the data from.
Any other questions or comments as Dave brought to the table now? So you got Renee? Yeah.
Hi, congratulations to the panel. I have a question about refugees, and there seems to be that there's a series of refugees or a group of refugees that are in transit, that usually they are moving away from their home to a new place, but they get caught up in the middle, like at the border in Mexico with Ukrainians and Haitians and all these people. And so sometimes cities or these regions do not know how to deal with those really quick growth or coming in of refugees. What is your take on that situation? What do you suggest?
That's exactly my biggest concern for the last 5-6 years since 2016 when the political climate changed in the United States, because this is the country has been accepting the largest number of the refugees, but we literally stopped receiving these people. And I heard the fact that those Rohingya people waiting, suffering in the refugee camps. And definitely, I know Bangladesh government really do not want to have more refugees coming into their place. And if we look at what's going on right now too, the Poland, Moldova, these countries really were not prepared for it. And even Oklahoma now, we have received in total 2,000 Afghan parolees. We don't call them refugees, but parolees. They will become refugees later. But 1,000 in Oklahoma City area, 1,000 in Tulsa area. But how many refugee resettlement agencies do we have? Historically, we receive annually 200. That could be the maximum in the state, unlike Texas. So I've been talking with these agencies. Were you ready for this? But they have to do this. They have to juggle. They get the quota from the Office of Refugee Resettlement, from the state, from the top federal places. You got to take these numbers. So that's exactly what's happening here too. I cannot think of any solution yet. But these people just working the extra hours constantly. I try not to bother them. And because of that, now we have so many Afghan parolees here. So many researchers now study all of this. I'm starting to contact these agencies. They literally told me, like, God, we're just getting all the emails from researchers. Please do this survey. Please do this interview. That's another reason I have not contacted them for my own research. We've been just doing some stakeholder interviews in Dallas area, but not in Oklahoma yet. But I know they're struggling. And sorry, but I don't think we have any solution. These things happening without our planning.
Maybe time for one more question. I had a list of things that were more just like observations, but I want to open it up to any more questions. Seeing a lot of overlap. I'm a huge fan. I wish these were actually like continuing education units today. Could have got credit for them. Any other thoughts or comments? Questions?
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead. Absolutely.
Your experience the transdisciplinary team to tackle this problem. We have our own transdisciplinary team, and I know, especially after today's symposium, I know the importance of this, to have all the different people from different expertise. So I'd like to know your experience about this.
Can you repeat that a little bit? Or summarize? Yeah, that's fine.
I'm sorry. I just want to know the experience of transdisciplinary team to tackle this climate change problem, what she experienced. So that's.
I have said repeatedly that I think they should study our teams because the group dynamics are fascinating. Just like when we go into a community, we want to learn their language, use the vocabulary that they use, and that was a struggle. That was a huge struggle at the very beginning because like the timestamp I was telling you, trying to coordinate just sensor readings to match and mesh up. There's also attitudes about how you approach people and working with people. The researchers aren't necessarily that sensitive. This group unincluded, the whole place unincluded. But it was fascinating. And hearing about the groups that broke up, right? Who were not able to move forward. They couldn't find a common ground or interests that they could overlap with. One of the more telling times was trying to, produce. We want to make sure that this is continuing, getting funding to go beyond. It's always try and find more funding. It's not leaving enough space to develop the relationships that are necessary, like we would do with community members, trying to work with each other. At one time, we still are working on the structured survey for the community. And one of the other researchers said, well, can't you just shorten it and make it a clipboard survey, and so that they could get it out and get it done? That took a month of playing mentor amongst people, which architects are uniquely qualified for, but to sort of try and get that to work. So I'm sure that you've had that as well. I will say that there weren't a lot of women in my group. Thank you, Dr. Cheng, for being there. But there weren't, so we broadened our vocabulary and upped our sensitivity level to each other. That was part of my experience. What about yours?
Probably we can publish an article about this, but do's and don'ts. But I've been lucky. We have 10 members. We have 2 more members here attending today. I have been learning a lot from all different people with the different backgrounds. And just like you said, we do use different terms for research. And sometimes we have to really be honest and we have to butt heads. But also, oftentimes, I feel like lucky to learn these things from all different colleagues, because I always say I'm so brainwashed with the social work. so much. I look at everything through my social work framework. I'm so brainwashed. But I've got my colleague from the library and information science and from the architecture business telling me, looking at the refugee issue from different perspectives, like eye-opening. Every time I have a meeting, I'm learning something different. So I think it's a wonderful thing happening at OU to see these groups.
Absolutely.
Yes,
absolutely.
So unfortunately, we're at time. If I may, I was going to leave us with 2 thoughts jotted down here. I think we saw a lot of varied scales and relationships to and interventions with people in place, right? So, that was wonderful. The second thing is, I think Dr. Fithian is on TikTok, so we can check that out later. She knows what that is. I learned that from my teenage daughters, so it is very popular. So thank you, everyone, for attending this session, for all the questions, to all the presenters and the panel here. We will take a short refreshment break over in the Sandy Bell Gallery just adjacent to this space. A few minutes of refreshments, and we'll begin the closing panel here led by Dr. Pilot right at 4:30. So take a few minute break. Thanks, everybody.